is Karen Guz. Her presentation is developing an outdoor watering ordinance. Karen is the Director of Water Conservation for San Antonio Water System. In this role, she leads a team that deploys conservation programs for residential, industrial, and institutional customers, resulting in over 1 billion gallons of savings each year. Karen is here today in her role as the presiding officer of the Texas Water Conservation Advisory Council, which provides input on conservation progress for the Texas legislature. And they do so much more, which she'll talk to you about today. The Advisory Council is very busy and doing lots of great things to support Texas utilities and water conservation. And with that, I will pass it over to Karen.
So thanks, Jennifer. You're going to give me a heads up if something's wrong with the sound or anything. I'm assuming it is all working. Jennifer mentioned that I have a day job, that I work for San Antonio Water System in the Conservation Department. And you heard from my colleague Dana yesterday, if you were on, about some of our programs. But today I'm focused on my role with the Water Conservation Advisory Council. Let's go to the next slide. If you're not familiar with us, the Water Conservation Advisory Council is something that was formed by the Texas legislature in order to assist keeping an eye on really how we're doing on the conservation side of things in our state water planning. There are 23 members from different stakeholder groups. The specific stakeholder group that I represent is municipal, but we've got folks in really every water using industry and type of users we have in our great and diverse state of Texas. Just some of the roles that we have include that we are to monitor progress on conservation. We report to the legislature before each session, and we have a report on that that's about to come out. We also develop best management practices, and we track technology options. So there are a few other things, but those are our major functions. Let's go to the next slide. And I think probably everybody on this webinar is familiar with our state water plan, that one of the challenges we have is that we'll have a small decrease over time in our available supplies. And of course, our demand in it as a state is going to go up as our population increases and other things grow. Just one of the solutions in our state water management plan is demand management. And if you look at this pie chart, it makes up a pretty good chunk of the water that's going to take care of future Texans. Let's go to the next slide. And I don't think I need to belabor that there are bad things that happen if we don't make our targets for water conservation. If we don't do the state water plan, including those very important 30% coming from conservation, we're going to have not meet our future demands, particularly during drought. And that's a key point to this outdoor focus that we have today. And also, there's an economic cost to not meeting those demands, even in a short period during a drought. Let's go to the next slide. Good news is that the Texas Water Development Board, which the Water Conservation Advisory Council serves with, has a lot of resources to help people with their plans that they turn into the Water Development Board and with their annual reports. There are, of course, staff experts with the Water Development Board. There is this great best management practice guide. So when you hear BMPs, that's what we mean. We all speak in acronyms, and I'm going to try not to do that. But the BMP guide I have a blurry screenshot of it here that shows there are quite a few, and there's a lot of information in each one about options that water providers can deploy in order to try to save water. Let's go to the next slide. And the focus that I'm going to have today is the BMPs that help us with this problem, our extremes of weather in Texas. I heard it yesterday, Texas being described again as drought punctuated by flood. It's unfortunate, but it does seem to be true. We're in a dry period once again in much of Texas, including where I am. And sadly, this is expected to just continue to be a challenge for us. The projections are that our temperatures are going to increase and that rainfall is going to continue to be unpredictable at best. And so it's pretty important that we get a handle on the outdoor water use that goes up when it's dry. Let's go to the next slide. So there are quite a few BMPs that address this, but before I mention those BMPs, I want to reiterate what a BMP is for the Water Development Board and for the Water Conservation Advisory Council. We heard it yesterday that the Texas Water Development Board is not regulatory. So certainly the Water Conservation Advisory Council is not regulatory either. We're an advisory group. We are volunteers who have a passion for water efficiency. And then a lot of other people not serving directly on the council also volunteer to work on these best practices guides, with the idea being that we want to put out a lot of information to help people with their planning. But none of these are mandatory. It's a situation of every water provider picks and chooses which things will work best for them. But these BMPs include a lot of resources to help you figure out how to run that program or that regulation or whatever you might choose. So just a few of them that relate to outdoor savings include the one I'm going to focus on today, irrigation scheduling guidelines. There's also one on maybe you want it to be against the rules to waste water in your community. Maybe you want an overall conservation ordinance. Another option is educating on our irrigation licensing standards. We have a great irrigation licensing program here in Texas. It's not optional. It is a law in Texas that you have to have an irrigation license if you are practicing irrigation, and there are really good standards that are supposed to be followed to ensure quality and efficiency. So that's a great option to educate your community on those standards. And then also, of course, helping people understand what's going on with their landscape and their irrigation. It's called surveys on the BMP. A lot of us call it consults or audits. So lots of options for outdoor. Let's go to the next slide. So beginning with this irrigation scheduling, what we mean by irrigation scheduling is not just having it be that people can irrigate whenever they want, as many days as the week as they want and any time they want. There's a lot of evidence that you're going to hear through the course of the 3 days that we don't need to water that often. And in fact, there's the old advice that used to be an inch of water once a week. Boy, has that been shown to be outdated for pretty much all of Texas. Evapotranspiration data, irrigation scheduling tools, scientific studies have all helped come together to show that really less is more when it comes to irrigating grass. But if you're going to think about putting this into a codified system in your community where it's saying, okay, here is what we do here. Here is the schedule we follow if you're going to run irrigation on your landscape. So some key steps. You want to, of course, gather that scientific data and evidence that a schedule is just fine and nobody needs to water every day or, very often at all, really. Key steps include cultivating stakeholder support. There's probably a lot of stakeholders out there, and I'll talk some more about them. Determine if you're going to have a rule and you're going to say this is how we do things, how are you going to enforce that? Is that going to be a utility rule of use where it would be perhaps a fine on the water bill if you didn't follow it? Or are you talking about a local ordinance where it might be a citation in municipal court? Lots of options, no right answer, just what is the best way for your community? Education is outlined in the BMP that, it doesn't do much good to have a rule unless everybody knows about it. And I contend that most people have to also think it's a pretty good idea, that you don't have enough enforcement capacity unless you're really educating people and convincing them, hey, this is reasonable, this is good for you and your water bill, you want to do it. So let's go to the next slide. I mentioned there's no one size fits all, and the BMP very much recognizes that. And we've seen this across Texas, that we have some places in Texas that have decided that they are going with no more than once a week year round. Others have said, okay, here's your twice a week schedule. Some places in the country have revised their schedule depending on the season, that have said, okay, and here's the summer schedule, it's now winter, here's the winter schedule. Other options to consider are you could decide to regulate only automatic irrigation systems that are controlled with the controller like you see here, and maybe not hose draggers. Things to consider also include, is it only spray irrigation, or are you also going to try to regulate all forms of irrigation, including drip or maybe even soaker hoses? So all things to consider. Let's go to the next slide. So I mentioned I was going to talk a little more about stakeholders to cultivate. And I think this is critical anytime you're considering having something new that's going to become a rule for a community. That's something to take very seriously. And you, of course, want to have all your supporters lined up before you even think about going forward with it. At least in my community, we would. So individual homeowners are key. Surveys are good to send out to people to find out, what do people think? Sometimes you might be surprised to find that if you send out a survey, people might say, boy, it would be more convenient if we were just always in some year-round level of rule rather than we're in drought, we're not in drought. So knowing those survey results among homeowners would be extremely helpful. HOA groups are key. They are likely to have opinions because some of them try to tell people they should water more. So it would be great to have as many of them on board as possible because you will have a few opposed. Irrigation stakeholders, you might assume that your irrigation association locally would oppose this. They might not. In San Antonio, there's been support from some of our professional irrigators for the idea of something year round. It drives them crazy to go back and forth and reset controllers all the time. Landscape stakeholders, same thing. They're going to have concerns about new landscapes, and you want to hear those ahead of time. And I'll come back to some of those things to consider that are outlined in the BMP. And of course, business stakeholders and elected officials. My comment on the business stakeholders from having to negotiate even drought rules is that their big concern they're going to want to hear is usually, so you're not going to shut me off for my processed water, right? Okay, fine. Don't really care so much what the grass looks like, but I really care if you're going to cut me off for my needs for my industrial processes or something. So kind of know what the arguments are from all of those. And the benefits to consider in outlining it for them include that when people have a schedule they're following, it really moderates their usage. And I like using that word moderates because you're not telling them they can't water their landscape, you're just moderating it. You're just putting a little bit of a rein on it so people don't get nervous and start watering every day. Compliance gets better and easier over time the longer that you're in it. This on-off changing that we do in San Antonio can be a challenging thing to get everybody on board with. One of the big selling points, I think, is eliminating the we're in a crisis mode of we're in drought. And sometimes the business stakeholders, chambers hate that because they think it makes it look like, we've got a problem with water versus this is just what we do here, maybe comes across better. I can tell you that from folks who hear about high bill complaints, they prefer us to be in drought restrictions in San Antonio because there are fewer when people are reined in a bit. So lots of reasons that are benefits to be able to outline and speak to as much as possible if you're considering this. Let's go to the next slide. So I mentioned that some of the concerns, if you go forward with this, that you're going to hear that we know about from people who've done this include, well, what about new construction? What about new landscape? What about athletic fields? What are you going to do? You're going to give everybody who runs their septic a ticket? So these are really easy things to mitigate with variances and procedures. And then, of course, you can figure out your enforcement options too. Let's go to the next slide. So I want to offer you some follow-up options though. If you are interested beyond knowing about this BMP, if you want to know about more BMPs, you want to know more about the Water Conservation Advisory Council, check out our activities. You go to savetexaswater.org and that tells you when we meet, it gives you the meeting minutes from our prior meetings and what our activities are. And we would love to have you as a volunteer on work groups. Work groups do all sorts of things. We work on specific issues like non-revenue water and updating more of the BMPs. And then please check out our legislative report. It's in draft right now, but it's going to be out of draft fairly shortly. And that gives a very nice summary of kind of what's happening, that progress report on conservation, and then recommendations that we are making to the legislature for the upcoming session. And with that, I'm going to stop and we'll see if there are any questions.
Thank you, Karen. What great information you have. And I do have a couple of questions for you.
Okay.
You just covered how to become involved in the Water Conservation Advisory Council, but you also mentioned that the state has an irrigation council. How can attendees that are on our summit today, or those that might be interested to share it with their city staff, can they become on the involved in the irrigation council?
Yeah, so if you are, the irrigation rules are under TCEQ, Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. And so if you look for TCEQ Irrigator Advisory Council, you're going to find the IAC, another acronym. And that's an advisory council that helps the TCEQ look at their irrigation licensing rules and education and the ways you keep up your irrigation license. The other thing you might want to check out, frankly, is how you complain. If you think in your community you have a problem with irrigation standards, there is a way through TCEQ to put forward a complaint, and they have advice they'll give you on having a local ordinance that actually would be more effective. So you might want to check out that whole BMP, frankly, on the
Perfect.
website.
One last question. What Texas utilities have a utility rule of use instead of a city ordinance? Are you familiar with utility rules of use?
It is, I could get this wrong, so someone from Austin will correct me if I get this wrong, but I believe Austin Water has gone with it being a fine on the water bill instead of a citation through municipal courts. In San Antonio, when we're in drought rules, we don't have a year-round day of week restriction, but we are often in once a week regulations. For us, it's a citation. And that has its pros and cons. And then Austin Water does, I believe, a fine on the bill, and then they can have their staff enforce it. So there's pros and cons both ways. And we would be happy at SAWS to tell you what's good and bad about the citation route. And I'm quite certain Austin Water would tell you the good, the bad, and the ugly about the route they've gone.
Okay, thank you, Karen. And we have time for another question. So let me read this. Let me follow up on, it says, in the woodlands, we have a citation, which we call a surcharge. It can go up to $200. So that would be an option as well. Okay, here's the next question. You stated that the old rule of thumb of 1 inch a week was no longer accurate. How does the average residential user get access to information that incorporates the science of ET?
That's a great question. The Texas A&M university system has ET data available on a lot of communities in Texas. And it may or may not be easy to access for you, but you can check the Water My Yard and do a search on ET data from the Texas A&M ET network. And that may help you acquire that data-driven advice on watering that'll help you, get a sense of it. In San Antonio, our most frequent advice we give out based on ET is only a half an inch or no watering. Often it's you don't need to water this week at all. And then other times it's a half an inch. So we rarely suggest an inch of water a week when we're looking at the actual data.
Yeah, that's very interesting because in the North Texas areas, we follow the rainfall and the weather patterns for ET. And even during drought, it was maybe once or twice during the year of drought that we had to water over a half an inch to add supplemental water for from our potable water supply through our irrigation. So yeah, ET is a great tool for our communities to tap into as a tool, another tool for their customers. Any other, let's see, I think I have one more question, which is, do you know of any effective programs for working with home builders on their use of irrigation and controlling the amount of water that they apply to the new landscapes?
That is a great question. We have been relatively successful with our variance programs with the builders because builders, of course, they're planting new landscapes and they want to be able to water it in. So we have negotiated how many weeks and what are the conditions of getting a variance from that once per week irrigation rule that we're so often under in San Antonio. And those variances are really important to the builders. They want those variances. We do it online, it's quick, but they've got to work with us on it. And so I think it's a give and take in working with builders. It helps a lot that they need something like the variance, or they need something else from the utility. So you have something they want, and then you need them to follow some, some guidelines on the watering as well. They don't like getting citations written to their corporation. So that they don't like, and that does happen if they don't work with us. But over the years, it's been a relationship building process, but over the years, it's gotten better and better for us working with the builders and the developers.
Right. Okay, one quick question. We have about 10 seconds left. What is your best advice when working with city councils if the councils are reluctant to pass some water use restrictions or ordinances? How best to handle it?
And Denise and Karen, we actually have 5 minutes, so we have more time.
Oh, we do. Oh, perfect.
Yes, yes.
I think I ended a little bit early. I think I went a little fast. So, I will tell you honestly that in San Antonio, the decision has not been to go with a restriction all the time at this point, because we're so often in stage 1. But they often care a lot about what their constituents think. And so it's helped us over the years when we've discussed those stage 1 rules and what they are and how they work, to have those survey results from the community that'll show us this many people said that once a week is fine with them and they don't have a problem with it. And we've pushed the survey out to the business community, and this is what we found out from them. But it was also a lot of boots on the ground where we did a lot of meetings with these various stakeholder groups to get them. When we want an ordinance change, we'll even ask for a letter of support from those stakeholder groups. So I recommend having your game on for working with the stakeholder groups and having that survey information for your council persons to be able to reflect on.
And that makes sense, because if it's the community that's asking for this change, then the council may be more apt to make those amendments because they have such a large constituents. Those that they're representing are asking for, those certain changes for water efficiency or guidelines.
The argument, I think, too, that seems to resonate sometimes with the chamber groups that can have a pretty loud voice in city council, at least in my community, is this idea that I've talked to them about is the chamber groups really hate the drought crisis perception, at least in San Antonio. They don't like it. And so some of them have considered this idea of, well, if we had something year round, we wouldn't have that. We're in stage 1 where you hate that idea that there's some kind of a crisis. It just becomes, there's no news to it because it's just what we do all the time. So I would encourage testing out that argument.
Okay, thanks. And then another question is, what do you mean by policing the watering?
What I mean is, when we've had watering rules that we're under, like we've been in this summer, our rules are very visible. We have it. I recommend that you have it so it's obvious to everyone who's in compliance and who's not. So for us, it's by address that determines when you're supposed to be watering or not. And so I call it, drive-by enforceability. Somebody can drive by and see this looks like someone's violating. Either the water is running down the street or the spray's going off the wrong day or time. Then they have a way that they can call it in. For us in San Antonio, we get a lot of compliance by citizens reporting to us, and then we educate by sending out notices to people. We do it by email and snail mail and calls to businesses. And I will say that most of the time we get compliance that way. Now, when I say policing, because ours is a municipal ordinance in San Antonio for drought, there's a citation at risk. So we have part-time police officers who can write citations and will for people who are really reluctant to get on board. And so for those who are reluctant, there does seem to need to be either a fine or a citation or something that they have at risk, even though the goal is to A, get most people just doing it because it's the right thing. That's the first thing we want. And then B, we remind them by letting them know, hey, somebody cares. Somebody noticed that maybe you're violating the rules. And then a lot of people will get on board. And then the last resort is you're going to get a fine or a citation. And hopefully that's a tiny percentage of the people in the community who would experience that.
How much would a citation be in San Antonio?
In San Antonio, the first citation is in effect with all the court fees and everything. It's only about $120. I do find that for us in San Antonio, the fact that it's a citation, some people just really react to that. It's not the money. They just really hate that it's a citation. And they can now pay online. They don't have to go to court. A pro side to me of the citation is that I call it when Mr. Important calls me. You know, somebody who perceives themselves to be a VIP will periodically call and say, you know, imply that their citation should be waived. And I appreciate being able to say, oh, I don't have authority over the municipal courts. I'm just a water utility employee. You're going to have to settle that with the courts. And that makes them back off right away. So that's the pro side to having it be a citation. The downside of it is it's a lot more paperwork than doing a fine on the bill. And you're pulling out a pretty big gun when you're going to citation versus a fine on the bill. So everything is pro and con. There's no perfect solution. I just would say you need some consequence that you're willing to do, as well as a procedure that if someone feels they've been wrongfully accused for the fine or the citation, that they have a way to say, you got it wrong and protest it.
And I think, you know, either whether it's a citation or what have you, it does open the door for the utility to actually provide some education and information that maybe they're not aware of. You know, maybe they're new to the area or have moved from another part of the United States. So it does open the education window to get with those, you know, citizens as well. I have another question. Let me pull it up real quick. Okay, it says we have ambassadors who patrol the community and if necessary write a citation. However, we're more interested in having a water conversation with them. We have had only a few who have had a second citation event. All second, third, and fourth citations are committed by businesses. That's interesting because you might think it might be a resident, but in this case, it's actually the business industry. They didn't say which community, but that brings up another question is, how does San Antonio work directly with the business community on irrigation practices?
We do a lot. Well, we do a lot of different things. And by the way, I call it the one and done. Most people get a warning and we never hear from them again, or we call it an alert, actually. They get that alert letter and then we have a conversation. Sometimes they actually email and apologize, say they didn't know. And then the few who get citations is almost all one and done. Almost no get two, and it is usually businesses because they have maybe trouble getting control of it. But we do a lot of different things. One that we don't have time to get into a lot now is that we have a regulation that they have to turn in an irrigation checkup annually if they're a big irrigation system or use 1 million gallons a year. And that is really key because they have to get control of their system. And we now have their contact information, which changes a lot in businesses. It can be a royal pain to keep up with what human do I talk to at that business. And so that annual checkup requirement, we get information on what human and their email and phone number should we be talking to if there's a problem. And we also really promote to the businesses, it is in your best interest to have us have your contact information. Because then if we hear a citizen report that you have a problem, we can call you and have a conversation instead of sending a police officer with a citation later. And so once they kind of understand that, which they over the years do, they'll sometimes proactively call us and update their information with our staff person because they get that it's in your best interest for Kathy to call you. That's what you want.
Yeah.
You want Kathy to call and say, there's a problem, why don't you fix it? And then it's over. And that's better for everybody.
Karen, you've been a wealth of information this morning, and I appreciate you sharing everything that you have on your presentation. And I'm sure if anybody has any other questions, please let us know, put them in the chat, or you can reach out to Karen directly. So Jennifer, back to you.